Well, hello everyone. Thank you for joining today for our expert series talk. So I started this expert series talks a couple of months ago to try to help both students and public and other people within the biological science to know a little bit more about the research that's going on around not just here in Southern California, but in other parts of the US, and why it's really important to be able to do research and how this research affects not affects, helps a lot of stuff that's going on here. And today I'm very pleased to introduce our expert series professor, which his name is Jamie Kneitel. I met him a couple of months ago at a conference, and he told me everything about his research, which sounded like pretty amazing. So I'm very excited to be able to hear a little bit more about what he's been doing up in Sacramento. So Dr. Jamie Kneitel is a professor and chair of the Department of Biological Science at the California State University, Sacramento. He received a bachelor's degree from UC Santa Cruz, a master's degree from CSU Northridge, and a Ph.D. from Florida State University. He then spent 2 years at the Tyson Postdoctoral Fellow at Washington University in St. Louis, and has been at CSU Sacramento since 2004. His research addresses how environmental variations affect diversity and functions of seasonal wetlands. This has been supported by many local, state, and federal funding agencies, including the National Science Foundation, and includes collaborations with agencies as well as national and international researchers. He was a Fulbright Scholars recipient in 2007 to 2018, and currently serves as a Fulbright Ambassador. He also serves in the editorial board for 2 international academic journals. And with that, you could go ahead and take it up from here.
Thank you, Anita. Thanks, and good morning, everybody. It's really great to be here, and I'm really excited to be able to talk about vernal pools. And while it's raining outside, I can feel those vernal pools maybe starting to fill, and talk to you a little bit not only about the system I work in, but some of the research that we're doing in our lab. So the title of my talk is Here Today, Gone Tomorrow, the Ecology and Conservation of California Vernal Pools. Let's see. Okay, hopefully we won't have any technical difficulties. Here we go. So, water is life. And of course, we can't overstate the importance of water. And especially when you think about it from the human perspective, all the benefits. We wouldn't be here without water, of course, and it's crucial for the food we grow, and for recreation, and for our drinking water, and so forth. And the benefits also include all the organisms we share this planet with, that they also depend on water. They depend on aquatic ecosystems, many of them, for their whole life. There are many, when we think about the freshwater ecosystems across the planet, of course, there are many, including streams and wetlands and lakes and so forth. And of course, we try to manage these systems the best we can. And not only for the organisms, the species, and the wildlife, but also for these benefits. However, there are also many harms that human activities bring to these ecosystems, and these include habitat conversion and pollution and so forth. And so these activities not only negatively affect these ecosystems, but by extension, the benefits that we gain from these ecosystems. So they're really crucial to kind of understand how these systems are affected, and how we can best manage and conserve these kinds of ecosystems. Now, most people focus, and we're talking, whether we're talking people interested in policy or management, land management or water management, or even scientists interested in aquatic ecosystems, most people tend to focus on these kinds of systems, the large permanent water bodies. And I've shown here on the left is Lake Tahoe, and then on the right is the American River, which is right here, flows through Sacramento. And so most people focus on these larger permanent water bodies. And so these systems look like this throughout the year and over decades and centuries and thousands of years. And you know, scientists will look at how those disturbances can affect these ecosystems, and by extension, the benefits that they bring. But there are many ecosystems, not only here in California, but throughout the world, that part of the year it looks like this, and part of the year it looks like this. And so these are systems that we would call, you know, seasonal aquatic ecosystems. There are many different names for this, and depending on where you are in the world, they have different names. But essentially, they're systems that fluctuate between being aquatic part of the year to being terrestrial part of the year, and they cycle through the system. These systems also tend to be much smaller than those big, large water bodies that we tend to focus in on. But here in California, these seasonal freshwater systems are quite diverse, and they're found throughout the state. And here a few of the common ones listed, including the intermittent streams. You can see an example of this up here. Floodplains, meadows, you can see that right there on the right. And the systems that I work in, on the lower part of these pictures, the rock pools and vernal pools. So these systems tend to be smaller, they're seasonal, they're not always aquatic, and they tend to be ignored by scientists and policymakers and general public alike. But we can go back to Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and use some of the wisdom from Sherlock Holmes, who stated, "It has long been an axiom of mine that the little things are infinitely the most important." And so I hope one of the things you take from my talk today is that these small aquatic ecosystems are incredibly important. And I just want to give you some examples of their importance and their presence. This map, I'm not going to get into all the details, but if you look at the blow up parts on the bottom of these different areas across the United States, all those little blotches you see are these smaller water bodies, whether they're wetlands or intermittent streams and so forth. And you can see that they're on a landscape scale, these ecosystems, these smaller temporary ones, are incredibly plentiful, and they are very dense when you think about it from the landscape scale. Another thing to think about with regard to these ecosystems is that they contribute a great deal to some of the benefits that we received. And this is a map produced by the United States Environmental Protection Agency. And this map is representing the contribution of these smaller temporary aquatic ecosystems to our drinking water. And so you can see it's incredibly diverse across the state. But you can see that for most counties that they can contribute. And when you think about it from, if you look at Southern California, I mean, we're talking 70, 80, up to 100% of the drinking water is coming from these smaller intermittent systems. Up here in Sacramento, you can see that they're in the 40 to 50% range. So so the take-home message from all this is that these smaller ecosystems are very concentrated, they're consistent, they're plentiful on a landscape scale, and they do contribute a great deal to many benefits. Okay, so this all brings us to the outline for my talk today. Most of it, I will be focusing on the ecosystem that I work on, California vernal pools, and I'll most of the times talk about their general ecology, their natural history, but also talk about their threats and conservation. Because many of these systems are directly tied to the climate, I'll also talk about climate influences, and then specifically talk about the research projects in my lab that have been focused on questions related to climate change. And then we'll have some conclusions at the end. So here in California, we're situated in one of the 5 Mediterranean climates. And if you look at this map, you can see something stand out about where these Mediterranean climates are. They are about 30 to 40 degrees in latitude. They're all coastal on the continents. And they all share a similar climate, which includes these long, hot, dry summers and cool, wet winters that we have here in California. One of the other important characteristics of these Mediterranean climates is that they are biodiversity hotspots when you look at it from a global perspective. So this is a map from Myers 2000. This was a paper that came out in Nature, which was addressing this idea of biodiversity hotspots. It's thinking about the ecosystems, locations in the world that had really high diversity, high biodiversity. They had high levels of endemism, so species found nowhere else, and species or locations that are also greatly reduced in their habitat. And along with kind of what we think about as high biodiversity locations across the globe, typically people will think about the tropics. But along with the tropics, there are also each of the 5 Mediterranean climates that are also biodiversity hotspots, including California. So California vernal pools are seasonal ponds. Vernal is Latin for spring, and these are seasonal ponds that emerge during the winter time and dry out by late spring. They are found from northern Mexico to southern Oregon, and they're incredibly variable in size, and they're considered geographically isolated wetlands, although they are connected to the watershed to a certain degree. And here are a couple of pictures to the right of vernal pools. But the overall cycle that occurs on an annual basis for California vernal pools is broken up into kind of 3 categories. During the winter time that we find first occurring right now is the winter phase. And so this is defined by, cooler weather. We start to get rainfall, and these vernal pools then build up, and you which results in an aquatic ecosystem. These tend to emerge in December or so, November, December, and can last through April. And again, it's highly variable, as you all know. If you've lived in California for any period of time, the rainfall in any given year is so variable. So this aquatic phase can look very different across years. But about late spring, with rainfall decreasing and temperatures increasing, they desiccate, and that aquatic ecosystem is then replaced by this flower phase. And this is a kind of one of the characteristics that vernal pools are well known for, these showy wildflowers that are found during the springtime. And I just want to also point out that there's a double entendre with the title of my talk, Here Today, Gone Tomorrow. And this really alludes to part of that, where we have the system here today, aquatic system here today, but gone tomorrow. And then of course the terrestrial phase is here today, gone tomorrow too. But I'll point out the other component of that double entendre in a little bit. So this happens in spring. It occurs for a very short time, and then most of the time, talking about most of the time throughout the year, we're talking the summer and fall period. It tends to look like this dry phase, where there's not a whole lot of above ground life going on here. People tend to really ignore this phase as well, and tend to look at this as really great locations to build a Walmart or build a housing complex, because vernal pools tend to be in these flat open areas, at least in our state. The California vernal pools are incredibly diverse in its flora and fauna. There are over 60 endemic plants and invertebrates. Endemic, I'll remind you, are species that are only found in this particular habitat. So there's over 60 of them. That's really an incredible amount for an ecosystem. And many of them are endangered and threatened, and this includes many aquatic vertebrates and invertebrates and plants. And right here are some examples of these systems. And here's just I guess a mosaic of some of my favorite plants and animals that are found during the aquatic phase and the terrestrial phase. Of course, we have tadpole shrimp and fairy shrimp of different species, frogs, California tiger salamander, a number of insects are also found. And of course, the showy wildflowers I was showing you earlier. Now, one of the most common questions I get when I give a talk is, how do these animals and plants deal with drought? And how do they deal with this shifting from aquatic to terrestrial and back to aquatic from year to year? And do they survive it? And my answer is always, yeah, they do just fine. When you think about it from a yearly perspective, they've evolved in this kind of ecosystem that's incredibly variable and shifts between aquatic and terrestrial. So I want to go a little bit into, how do they survive these dry, wet shifts in the ecosystem? And how I like to describe it is that the two strategies are they're either time travelers, represented here by Back to the Future, or they're space travelers, represented by Battlestar Galactica. So let's jump into the time travelers first. They're also called passive dispersers. And that's because they have no adaptations to be able to disperse from one location to the next. The only way that they get from one location to the next is by movement through various dispersal vectors, including water or wind, or even getting attached to an animal's fur or foot. But how they interact with these ecosystems, how they survive these shifts, is by producing what are called resting eggs. And you can see a picture right there of a number of different species resting eggs. And essentially what they are resistant shelled dormant embryos. So these are essentially eggs that have these really resistant shells. These resting eggs can sit in the soil for decades and decades. They've revived resting eggs that have been hundreds of years old. And so they can sit in the soil waiting for the right time to hatch. And a lot of them are very specific in the environmental cues that are needed to hatch. So here you see the eggs to the right. You can see here in this picture of a fairy shrimp and the egg sac right there holding the resting eggs. So again, how they deal with this drying out is they just sit in the soil waiting for the rains to come back. And so those are the time travelers. The space travelers are ones that can actively disperse from one location to the next. So they will occupy these pools during that aquatic phase, but once it starts to dry out, they can go escape to other permanent water bodies. And so they can fly from one system to the next. For a lot of them, including mosquitoes and some fly species, they will lay their eggs in the aquatic habitat, and the larvae will develop and just pupate and migrate away as adults. So those are space travelers. They have these adaptations of being able to move from one location to the next. Now, plants are just weird. they do their own thing. They can easily survive. They're kind of time travelers because they produce seeds, and those seeds can withstand the shifting between wet and dry habitats. But they have their own host of adaptations that are really cool in being able to live in this extreme environment of aquatic and terrestrial. They have a lot of times they have very specific times in which they germinate. So some will hatch, some will germinate when the pools are full, but some will germinate once the pool dries. A lot of them have adaptations with regard to their leaf shape. And so there are some species that produce one kind of leaf when it's filled with water, and a second kind of leaf when the water has dried out. Both leaves being more adapted to that kind of habitat. Some of them have hollow leaves and stems that allow them to breathe when these pools are filled with water. And there's just a number of very specific physiologies that are adapted to this shifting system. So let's move on to the threats for these ecosystems. They are quite numerous, but really what heads the list is habitat loss. And this is through urbanization and agriculture. And this is not only here in California, but worldwide. For example, this upper left-hand picture, this is from Morocco. When I was there sampling, doing some work, and my collaborators indicated that, where that house stood, there was a pool that was there the year before. And you can see these rocks there that are new as well. But of course, if you've flown over the Central Valley, you would see how developed the Central Valley is with urban and agricultural development. And these really negatively affect the vernal pools. to the extreme. So this is a map showing kind of pre-1900s land cover in the Central Valley. And you can see it's dominated by aquatic habitat and riparian, and which included vernal pools. And these days, it's less than 10% of these California vernal pools persist in our state. So there, have seen a over 90% reduction in this habitat. And certainly that's resulted in many of these species being threatened and endangered. Joe Morgan from the EPA this week was posting these really dramatic pictures of vernal pool habitat loss on Twitter. And I wanted to show you some of that. This is from 2005, the upper left-hand picture. By a decade later, you can see that it's starting to be encroached by, and this was vernal pool habitat, and you see this encroachment of development, and then even 5 years after that, 4 years after that, you see development even further. So this is a continuing situation that is resulting in habitat loss of vernal pools, which is very concerning. And there are many other threats, especially, not only do you have habitat loss, but now all that habitat is interacting more with human development. And so you get increases in draining and infilling, increases in invasive species. Overgrazing is another threat. And also you have increased exposure to fertilizers and pesticides that can really dramatically affect these systems. One way to deal with this habitat reduction is by constructing new pools. And this is quite common, and I'm not going to go into all the details. These are results from one of my graduate students who we looked at constructed and natural pools at 10 sites throughout California. So this was from San Diego to Southern Oregon, and looked at whether these constructed pools reflected the natural pools. And what we see is that there's lower abundance of many of those threatened and endangered species, overall lower abundance for all the other species as well. And finally, you see this really dramatic difference in the community composition in the two habitats. And it's still unknown whether, a lot of those ecosystem services are also still provided by these constructed pools. I want to touch on some of the work we're doing in my lab. We have a kind of multi-pronged approach to studying vernal pools. We do research in the laboratory. You can see here on the left. We do some very specific studies on particular organisms. We also do what are called mesocosm studies, and these are, think of them as just big buckets, big cattle tanks that we can line the bottom with vernal pool soil and do all kinds of manipulations that you wouldn't be able to do out in natural vernal pools. So that's another approach, very common approach. And then finally, we also do studies out in natural vernal pools as well. And in my lab, we approach the system holistically. We don't study just the aquatic or just the terrestrial, which is common, the most common approach. But we take on the whole system and how the aquatic and terrestrial can interact with each other and influence each other. And I have students that are studying the plants during this terrestrial phase, but I've also had students doing plants in the aquatic phase, and we do everything from bacteria to vertebrates, so and invertebrates, of course. So we kind of touch on it all, and there are many different questions that we address in the system, looking at the population dynamics of species, to species interactions like competition and food webs, but also we touch on the questions related to conservation and management and restoration. And so, any one of these points could be a whole talk. But today I'm going to focus in on some of the work we've been doing recently, looking at climate change effects, and can we through our research kind of better understand how these systems may in the future respond to this changing climate. So we know that that at least here in California, that over time we're seeing increases in temperature. We're also seeing a decrease in precipitation overall. So that's temperatures on the left here, and on the right is precipitation. So we're seeing warmer and drier conditions occurring. And when you look at models about what the future has in store for us, first of all, they can be, the predictions are variable depending on the type of model, but for the most part, what is anticipated is that we're going to see a continuing and increase in temperature, and also a decrease in precipitation and rainfall. So how are these kinds of conditions going to influence our system? Now, this is a question that that myself and a group of people from throughout the world have been interested in. So people who study these wetlands, both temporary and permanent ones. And a couple of years ago, well, this was published this year, but we started compiling data from throughout the world on these kinds of systems, and tried to address that question. And so you can see we had practically every continent represented here. And overall, what we found was that ecosystems that tend to be drier, and ecosystems that tend to be high elevation and cooler ones were going to be the ones that were most affected by the changing climate. So here, essentially, this is what these two figures are representing, that these drier locations are going to be more vulnerable to climate change. And so California would be included down here in this kind of right-hand corner, lower right-hand corner. And then up in these, these cooler parts, those are
exactly. So that,
I think I built it.
oh,
so the so if we look at temperature also throughout the state, we have this really interesting gradient from the southern part of the state that is the desert region. And as you head north, we see an increase in rainfall, and we also see a decrease in temperature. So we have this really interesting climate gradient here in California that allows us to address some of these questions as well. And if we look at the vernal pools across the state, what we find is that as you go, as would be predicted, as you go from the southern part to the northern part, so here, this would be the southern part of the state, all the way up to the northern part of the state, what we see is that the size of the vernal pools increase as you go further north, right? This would be what we anticipate. And now, along with that increase in vernal pool size, those vernal pools also stay around longer too. And what results with the organisms that live in these vernal pools is that as you go from the south to the north, we also see an increase in biodiversity. So biodiversity increases as you go from the southern part, the southern dry part of the state to the northern part. And a lot of this has to do with the size of the vernal pools and the fact that they are going to be around longer during any given year in the northern part of the state. Some of the other studies that we've been doing in our vernal pools has been directly looking at how warming affects the vernal pool community. This work is from Robin Shin, who is a graduate student in my lab, and we published this in a few years ago. And the take-home message, I'm not going to get into all the gory details, but the take-home message was that with increases in temperature, we saw an overall increase in the abundance of invertebrates in the vernal pools. But this also included mosquitoes. And also concerning was that temperature increases negatively affected those endemic species, those fairy shrimp that are only found in the ecosystem. The last study I'll talk about is one that I did some years back, where I was looking at how the timing of rainfall can affect the vernal pool communities. And so not only is that concerning not only the temperature and rainfall amount, but also shifts in when the rainfall comes is also a possibility with climate change. And what I found was that when vernal pools filled in the late spring, we ended up having these just huge outbreaks of mosquitoes. And this is compared to the aquatic communities that were there for the whole year. So take-home message from this is that that those native endemic species aren't going to be influenced all that much by kind of the shifting of when the rainfall happens, but it will result in an increase in mosquito abundance with later rainfall. Okay, so in conclusion, I just want to point out that that this greatly reduced habitat, and that was the second entendre, I forgot to mention it. It was that here today, gone tomorrow is also refers to the fact that these systems are greatly reduced and we're losing them, every year. But this greatly reduced habitat supports really high biodiversity, many species found nowhere else, and many endangered species. And that climate dependency of this ecosystem, because it's all, the whole reason the system is there is because of these cool, wet winters we're experiencing now. With a changing climate, it's going to be more vulnerable to the patterns of temperature and rainfall that is anticipated. And by extension, those effects could also harm us and the benefits that these ecosystems provide, not to mention the fact that we have these amazing ecosystems with these really cool species that are found nowhere else and have these incredible adaptations. And so finally, increased efforts to really reduce that habitat loss is extremely important, as well as just better understanding this ecosystem and how they're going to respond to changing climate, but also human disturbances and human activities. So with that, I will leave you with a sunset from a temporary pond vernal pool from the Atlas Mountains of Morocco. And I'd be happy to take any questions. Thanks for listening.
Well, thank you for your talk, or everyone in here is clapping. So does anyone have any questions? Anyone in the room or in the chats? Okay, so Chloe does have a question. She's gonna come over.
Hello, I'm Chloe. I had a couple questions, but I'll start with one. So I was looking at the image that showed all the destruction of all the vernal pool habitats, and I was curious. I feel like that should be hard to do to urbanize such an area, but I was thinking about, what are vernal pool habitats classified as? So for example, like coastal wetlands are classified as coastal land, so it's difficult to actually develop on those lands without a lot of other permits and being, getting the okay from other agencies. So do vernal pools, are they technically protected habitat or classified as something?
Yeah. They're protected, and I'm not sure the technical classification of them, but they're certainly protected. But they're still being built on. They're still being developed. You can purchase your mitigation,
Right.
but they are protected systems, and they support endangered species, both state and federal. So, but we still are experiencing that loss.
Yeah, fortunate.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can see if anybody else. Right. Okay, I'll jump in. Oh wait. Okay. I'll jump in with another question. So I'm more of a fish person, and I might be wrong, but is it true that the desert pupfish also inhabit vernal pools in some areas?
I think those are, so I don't know much about the pupfish, but I think those are permanent water bodies, though.
They're permanent.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. That makes sense. I was just curious, like, how do the fish get there, and like, how do they survive?
So the interesting thing is, like, in vernal pools, okay, they don't have fish. So vernal pools didn't, and that's part of that's what results in this high biodiversity. So a lot of these organisms that you see, those fairy shrimp and tadpole shrimp and clam shrimp, hundreds of millions of years ago, they were found in every aquatic system. And of course, with the diversification of fish and their entry into new habitats and niches and so forth, they pretty much eliminated those brachiopods from most of the aquatic systems. And now this is where you tend to find them in these temporary water bodies that you won't find fish in.
Mm-hmm.
And so, so that's a kind of the interesting story with the fish and fairy shrimp connection.
Yeah. And would you say that like all of these invertebrates are especially adapted to live with the seasonal aspect of the vernal pools? So if you were to put those invertebrates into a permanent freshwater system, would you predict that they would be outcompeted because they're like adapted physiologically to withstand the stressful habitat? But if they were put in a freshwater habitat that's permanent, they probably wouldn't survive.
That's a great question. It sounds like a nice project you can.
Great. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because the fairy shrimp, they tend to have, that's something that I would probably predict, that a lot of the fairy shrimp tend to be the first ones that emerge when these vernal pools fill up. And so they come up and they do their thing, and then their life cycle is typically completed before you have all these other organisms that kind of emerge out of the soil or disperse into there, like the insects, and so so they would probably be hit hard by both competitors and predators in permanent water bodies.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Okay, last question.
Okay, go for it.
So when you're talking about, I had no idea that those invertebrates went into those little egg casings, and that's how they live in those habitats. It reminded me of tardigrades. I think they do something similar. Do you find tardigrades in vernal pools?
I've never seen that. I've never seen them in vernal pools, but I don't do a lot of the micro work. That would be really a great student project to look at, that kind of micro world of protozoans and rotifers and tardigrades. And I wouldn't be surprised if you would find them in the
Yeah,
system.
probably.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, super cool. Those resting eggs are really just amazing because one of the other things, they can go through digestive systems and still be viable.
Oh my gosh, that's incredible. Wow.
And that's another way that they can disperse in space.
Right.
Through the digestive system.
Wow, very cool.
Yeah, they can withstand a lot of very harsh conditions.
Mm-hmm.
But they also have very specific environmental cues that are needed to break their dormancy. And so things like, one of the problems with invasive species, plant species that invade vernal pools is that the plants slowly decompose compared to the native plants in vernal pools. And so what you end up with is year after year, you have this accumulation of thatch, and that thatch layer in vernal pools. And that can influence these invertebrates as well because a lot of them are light sensitive. So they need, and again, it's species specific, but some of the ones that I've worked with and we've done experiments on, they need light, they need water that isn't polluted by nutrients and so forth in order to break their dormancy.
Okay, cool. Awesome. Well, thank you. Those are all my questions, and it was a great talk.
I have a few questions about plants if you got time. So my first question is a fun one. You had some really awesome photos of wildflowers, and I was just wondering, is there one in particular that's your favorite? Looked like there were maybe some cool monkey flowers and stuff.
Yeah, it's that tricolored monkey flower. That's probably my favorite. That's probably my favorite. Why, do you have a favorite?
Oh man, I like Mariposa lilies. I don't know. It's hard to pick a favorite though, for sure.
Yeah.
And then my other
That mimulus
Sorry, go ahead.
tricolor that you find in vernal pools, I would probably list that as my favorite. Oh no, but although, hold on, so that's maybe I have different categories because
Okay.
so that's one of
allowed.
them. But there's also witch's hair that we also have in vernal pools. And oh God, the species name is
Daughter, yeah.
oh God,
Yeah, I'm trying to look these up as you say them. Is it Alectoria sarmentosa?
No. Oh God. Anyways, so witch's hair is a parasitic plant that is found in oh God. I'm trying to so witch's hair is a parasitic plant, and it's this orange and stringy mass of plant. And so they don't photosynthesize. They have these specialized roots that tap into the into other plants, and that's where they get all their nutrients and water and energy and so forth. And so the Cuscuta, thank you.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Yeah, daughter.
Oh God.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Cuscuta and Hoeliana is the species name. And I really love that species. It's just so cool. Just the whole lifestyle of a parasitic plant is it just amazes me. And they're flowering plants, so they have little flowers and produce seeds and so forth. And I had a graduate student, Andrea Graffis, some years back, do some experiments out in the field where we removed the parasitic plant in vernal pools. And what we found was that Cuscuta was acting as a keystone predator in vernal pools. And so it tended to attack these larger, more dominant species in the vernal pool, which resulted in an increase in biodiversity of the vernal pools when the parasitic plant was present. When you remove them, those dominant species just become more dominant. And you get a lowered biodiversity. And then one other point that we found in that study was that the presence of the parasitic plant, while they increased biodiversity and cover, that was true for both native plants and exotic plants. So there was that too. But anyways, that's probably one of my favorite plants.
Yeah, no, I can totally see why. I'll look that one up in a sec, but yeah, here in the salt marshes of Southern California, we have Cuscuta pacifica, and yeah, the flowers are just so tiny and dainty, and it's such a trip to find it. Just these orange threads with little flowers on it. It's so cool.
Yeah. If you want, you can shoot me an email and I'll send you the paper.
Okay, yeah, definitely. And then my other question was, what invasive plant species do you have the biggest problem with in vernal pools?
There's so many. I mean, it's all the ones that you tend to find in the grasslands here in California. Right. So the Avena and, even Erodium. So non-grass, also the invasive forbs, but definitely Bromus and Avena. All the typical ones you see in the grasslands here.
Gotcha.
And Sharon Collins has done some awesome work with that. And one of the things that they found, her and her lab has found, was that these drier years. See, when you have the vernal pools filling, that tends to keep the invasive plants out of vernal pools, because a lot of those grasses and forbs, the exotic grasses and forbs, cannot tolerate they can't tolerate that inundation. And so, but when you have these years that are really dry, all those invasive plants can really invade the vernal pools. And that can have these long-term effects, as I pointed out earlier, because they accumulate this thatch that then can prevent other plants and also the invertebrates from emerging in the vernal pool in the following year. So,
very cool.
Yeah.
So
And
I
I have
did,
So,
sorry.
go ahead.
I did have a question though, kind of like, especially here in Southern California, we're not getting, a lot of rain compared to what you guys are getting up there. But I have noticed, because there is a vernal pool here at Fairview Park, and it's like one of like the largest here in like the OC area. But I know we've seen like not many bird species around that area, especially, because it's not filling up. Are you guys looking at bird species, especially during like the wintering season? Like, do you guys are seeing like less biodiversity of birds around the area because, changes in climate?
Yeah, we really don't. I did have a student who wanted to work on that project, a project that looked at those issues, looking at the bird use in vernal pools and how it may be influenced by land use and other sorts of factors. And it ended up being pretty difficult to accumulate data for her. And so we kind of went in a different route with that study, where she did birds in urban and suburban and natural areas here in the Sacramento area. But that's definitely an open question that merits further study. These are important locations for birds to stop off at, ones that are migrating, yeah, there's just some. I know they're important for a number of species, but yeah, we don't have any kind of direct studies of that.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I was just curious if there was any studies on it. My other question. Yeah, sorry. Like the other question I had was, so you mentioned that you have like different sampling like within the buckets. So like what kind of stuff are you studying within, like what kind of stuff are you studying within each replicate, I guess you could say?
So yeah, in my lab we do all kinds. So again, the great thing about that approach is that I talked about the resting eggs, right, and the seeds and stuff. So we can line the bottom of those with soil and add water, and those species emerge. And we can do experiments that we normally could not out in nature for obvious reasons. But I have, let's see, right now I have a student who, Monica Cole, who is looking at the effects of fire retardants in vernal pools. So, with increasing fire, and this is true around vernal pool habitat, you have the dumping of fire retardants to control the fires and put them out and so forth. And some of those chemicals can make their way into vernal pools potentially. And so she's looking at how vernal pool communities respond to that. I have another student in my lab who is looking at herbicide effects on these species. And some of the work that I showed earlier, where we were able to we used basically aquarium heaters to warm the vernal pools a couple of degrees. So we were able to do experiments like that. And I have another master's student who's finishing up, and she looked at competition between, in fact, there was a question earlier about competition. And so she looked at the effects of competition with those fairy shrimp and how that affects growth rates. So we do all kinds, and then you can manipulate, as I showed, when the pools fill up, when they dry out. And we've had so many other studies. I had another master's student, who manipulated frog tadpoles and looked at how that influenced vernal pool communities. So we can, and the list goes on. Eutrophication, we looked at nutrient pollution, and looked at how that responded, how the vernal pool community responded. So yeah, it's really the questions are endless, you know, when you think about it. The possibilities. It's really a great approach to better understanding the system.
Yes, thank you. Are there any more questions? Well, if there isn't any more questions, thank you so very much, you know, for giving the talk about vernal pools. We definitely got to learn a lot more compared to what we knew before or didn't know anything at all. So I'm really excited I got to hear a little bit more about what you guys are doing. And thank you again.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. And if anybody else has any questions or feel free to email me. I'd be happy to answer them or send you the papers that, you know, any of the papers in our lab.
Yes, I think I'm definitely going to email you the one about the invasive species one. Because I know for like my project, we also looked at, I specifically look at invasive plant species, and we did look at decomposition rates. So I definitely would love to see that one. Yeah,
I did have a student, we didn't publish it, but I did have a student who looked at decomposition rates of invasive versus native vernal pool plants, and also how it affected not only decomposition rates, but how it affected the water chemistry too. So that's kind of interesting, because with decomposition, you know, of course, it's going to change that chemistry. So yeah, I'd love to hear about what you're doing too.
Yes. I will definitely send you over what I have. Right. Okay, well, thank you so very much. And thank you all of you guys for attending today. And hopefully we get to see you guys on our next talk next month in January.
Thank you. Have a
Thank
great
you.
day.
Thanks, you too. If it's